So what are we going to cover today? So look, we're going to do a deep enough dive in a non-engineering sense on everything that ChatGPT is and isn't. We're going to obviously have a lot of fun in the very unsettled state of AI law today. We'll look at how best to integrate ChatGPT into a law practice, or indeed any company, really. But again, the focus of this is obviously on law practices. And we're hopefully, time permitting, going to get a brief look at kind of where things are headed, what happens next, and frankly, what all the big risks are that many of you have probably heard about. Just to give you a bit of a teaser, we're going to talk about the lawyer in New York who majorly, put foot in mouth using ChatGPT. Yes, we're going to talk about the recent defamation suit against ChatGPT, why there's probably no copyright infringement involved with AI-generated works, at least in my opinion, there shouldn't be. And yeah, we'll do a fairly nice overview of what's going on with US AI law and EU AI law. And by the way, yeah, all the imagery that you see is created by me with the AI image generation tool, Midjourney. Look, there is no way to deep dive on all of this stuff in 60 minutes. Obviously, I'll do my best to cover as much as we've got. And no, I do not have all the answers. And you know why? Because nobody has all the answers. So that's actually what makes this space so exciting for me. And indeed, I think for anybody working in it, including and especially in law, because this is about as close as we can get to effectively a whole new field of law. I mean, as you'll see in a bit, this whole thing just blows up like a can of worms. It's pretty mind-blowing, some of the analysis we'll go through. Some of you might have thought you recognized the title here to this talk, The Undiscovered Country. It's obviously a reference to Hamlet, Act 3, Scene 1. The to be or not to be speech is a reference to the undiscovered country. Here, though, Hamlet is referencing the afterlife, the unknown, and whether indeed it's worse than the hardships of life itself. In the 6th Star Trek film, the reference was to the unknown about peace with the Federation. And here now today, we are facing a very real unknown with AI once again. So I thought the title was a pretty apt one for this talk. So, all right, what is ChatGPT? Let's just start very briefly with a history of AI. I'm just going to rattle through this. I don't want to just read things to you verbatim. But suffice to say, I think Isaac Asimov doesn't get enough credit. He was arguably the first one to really kind of popularize AI with his robots book series, most famously the novel I, Robot. He's the one who first coined the term positronic brain, which you might recognize from Star Trek as well. Going through time, artificial intelligence as a term seems to have been coined in or around 1955. More recently, yep, obviously Star Trek got really deep with the concept of artificial life. Obviously, IBM's Deep Blue beat Garry Kasparov at chess. More recently, a computer, AlphaGo, beat the world's best Go player. And of course, here we are today with OpenAI, Stable Diffusion, Midjourney, and so on. Where are we headed? Yeah, probably we're going to get to so-called artificial general intelligence a lot sooner than anticipated, like on the order of several decades sooner than anticipated. And therefore, the so-called singularity should be upon us much sooner also than anticipated. Singularity is the point at which artificial general intelligence is indeed superhuman cognition spanning all fields of, well, thought and understanding. All right, so we're going to touch on technically what ChatGPT is, and we're going to circle back to this 2 more times during this talk because this is critically important to understand everything that we're going to talk about later on in a legal sense. So ChatGPT is an LLM. No, not that kind, not your kind. LLM as in large language model. It's just a type of so-called generative AI. A GPT is a type of LLM. It stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformer. It's the thing that OpenAI built, of which ChatGPT is the product that makes use of the GPT. It's generative in the sense that it, well, generates stuff. It outputs things like text. It's pre-trained. Literally, it's ingested with a bunch of data, for instance, scraped internet data, specifically as of September 2021. And then it learns rules based on that data, which is then discarded. So keep that in mind. As I said, we're going to come back to this 2 more times. It's a transformer, also not that kind, in the sense that it is context aware. So it knows what words go with what other words contextually in a cognitive understanding sense. Again, much more on this later. It is natural language. It's not yet superhuman in terms of cognitive abilities, and it's also not really quite yet sentient, although we're getting fairly close. It's, yeah, it's close. I know some of you might be wondering, why do you need to know all this? Again, I promise it's critically important to understand the technical underpinnings of how this works. It'll make sense about halfway through this talk. You'll be happy we dived into this. So what can ChatGPT do? I'm assuming that you've all either played with this exhaustively, or maybe some of you not at all, but suffice to say, look, it'll communicate in just about any language. It's really, really good at coding. It can now pass the bar exam in the 90th percentile. This is ChatGPT 4. This is the version that you get when you pay $20 a month for GPT Plus. This is in contrast to the free version, which is GPT 3.5, which comes in at something like 10%. So huge, huge step change improvement there. It's really good at pretending and simulating things. We might touch on this a bit more later, but suffice to say, you can get it to kind of role play whatever you need. Again, I don't want to just ramble off things verbatim, but suffice to say, this is a decidedly non-exhaustive list of stuff. I mean, there's a virtually limitless set of fields for which this has potential life-changing, civilization improving value, and potentially harmful value. Well, not value, potential harm for civilization as well. Obviously, there's a ton of shortcomings. Depending on what version of ChatGPT you're using, and indeed what generative AI product you're using, whether it's ChatGPT or Google Bard or Microsoft Bing, it's probably not browsing the internet live. The free version of ChatGPT decidedly does not do so unless you pay for it and enable that functionality. It's cut off in September of 21. Obviously, the big issue of copyright infringement is one of the most, shall I say, exhilarating and unknown field of law that we're going to dive into later today. The whole thing about hallucinations, fabricating non-facts. This is obviously a very real issue. Data privacy, we'll touch briefly on that. Obviously, ethical concerns. Computers are extremely energy thirsty to run these things. So that's just something to keep in mind. And there needs to be a bit more transparency on how they're actually learning. We're going to, again, come back and touch on all this later. So fundamentally, how does it actually work? Like, what's going on here? So this is something that I've never seen discussed or written about anywhere. This is a very nuanced thing that really critically needs to be understood. A large language model like ChatGPT is a probability engine, for lack of a better term. GPT-3 had what's called 175 billion parameters, or if you like to think of it in Carl Sagan's voice, 175 billion parameters, and the new version has 100 trillion parameters. These are remarkably huge numbers, but the important thing is they're not talking about data. It's not like gigabytes or terabytes, or, it's not even characters of scraped data. The parameters is just sort of an ambiguous term, which means the learned rules, the interconnected associations as between words based on the training data. So what this means practically is that, well, for instance, when you Google something, Google's actually feeding you content from its index across all of its data centers around the world, right? So it's actual content that is stored in a data center, and then it's extracted when you request it, like the actual content, right? Here with an LLM, the training data is used once and done. And there is no sort of ongoing training, contrary to popular belief. Again, we're going to dive into this a lot deeper when we talk about copyright, but the point is, when you're querying something like ChatGPT, you are not in fact interacting with that training data. You're interacting only with that probabilistic word association cloud of stuff that it pre-trained. Remember the P in GPT, that it pre-trained on the data that it was fed back in September of 2021. We'll touch a bit about what this means for live internet queries a bit later, but just keep this in mind. We're going to come back to it one more time. Don't worry. Very quickly here, I know there's a lot of small print here, but suffice to say, everything blue and red is ChatGPT 4. Everything yellow or gold or whatever that is GPT-3. So you can see in general a marked improvement in capability. The far left one is the bar exam. Immediately to the right is the LSAT. You've got the GRE somewhere in the middle there. Calculus all the way at the extreme right. So really mind-blowing improvements here. Just a quick footnote. The idea is with large language models, it literally is that, right? It's the recognition that anything whether it's math, whether it's imagery, or indeed any sort of concept, any cognitive construct can be realized with text, with language. And this is a really important realization that was that kind of has enabled this revolution in AI, in generative AI specifically. Why is this all even possible? Well, to be super clear, this is not computing capability generally in the world over time. This is the amount of compute power being thrown at AI training specifically. As you can see, it's been essentially linear up until about the 2010s. And then all of a sudden, as we approach 2015, we've gone from doubling every 2 years to an astonishing 10x every year. This is obviously in no small part thanks to the good folks over at NVIDIA. It turns out that their video game graphics cards are exceptionally good at training AI. So once again, video games are not a waste of time after all. So what does this mean as a product? This is totally mind-blowing. So many of you have probably seen this, but it's worth just calling something out, which is perhaps missed. TikTok was the fastest growing thing in human history. It reached 100 million monthly active users in just 9 months. ChatGPT took just 2 months to reach that milestone. On its own, that's already a mind-blowing metric. But do you notice anything interesting about the apps? These are all social media apps, right? This means that they all fundamentally benefit from a thing called network effects, right? So the utility of Instagram to just one user on Instagram is obviously effectively zero, right? And so your utility with a social media app increases as more people join it, right? ChatGPT is by definition not a social media tool. It doesn't benefit whatsoever from so-called network effects. There's no benefit, right, to more people joining ChatGPT for it to offer utility to you. So the fact that it grew this quickly and without the benefits of network effects, or rather without the need for network effects, this is just completely mind-blowing from a product point of view. So just something to keep in mind in terms of context. Let's just cut to the chase for a moment. Is AI going to take your job? Maybe, maybe not. It depends. It's a good question, obviously. So I sort of define AI in the job space as sort of two types of things, right? It's potentially a utility multiplier. One good example is that the CEO of a help desk software called Freshworks, he claims that ChatGPT has enabled his development team to reduce coding time for a certain type of job from 9 weeks just to a matter of days. On the other hand, it's also indeed potentially a very real risk for people to lose their jobs. It can indeed be a human replacer. ChatGPT has actually replaced 250 employees for an energy company in the UK, I believe, called Octopus Energy. So look, there will be lost jobs for sure. But crucially, it's not so much that AI is just going to take human jobs, but rather that humans with AI will take jobs from humans without AI. And I think that's an important distinction. There is, by the way, a whole new field of jobs, the somewhat awesomely named prompt engineers. These things, at least in the San Francisco Bay Area, these things are paying, I'm not exaggerating, $200,000 to $300,000 plus per year. It's the sort of dark science, the dark art, if you will, of, well, prompting something like ChatGPT to produce the desired output that you're looking for. In general, it's actually a plain English thing. It's not even code. You can obviously do this with code, but this is, it's just an entirely new field of not really engineering, but something which is critically valuable to maximizing output from these generative AI tools like ChatGPT. So very briefly, let's just fly through this. If you haven't tried it yet, it's very simple, very low barrier to entry. Just go to chat.openai.com, create an account. I strongly recommend to pay the $20 a month. It's super easy to cancel, to try GPT-4 rather than 3.5. And then make sure you download the iOS app. If you have an Android, I think it's available on Android, but what's really cool and weirdly not talked about much is the iOS app enables you to talk with ChatGPT using OpenAI's Whisper voice-to-text transcription. And when I say that it is completely 100% human, fluid, organic comprehension, I mean precisely that. It is absolutely mind-blowing. Like toss everything you know about talking with Siri in that sort of stilted, precise fashion, and rather imagine talking as fluidly and as quickly and as, with as many misspoken bits of dialogue as you can imagine as you would just speaking to a friend. That's how fluently and perfectly this voice to text comprehends. It's completely mind blowing. But look, let's skip back past this for the moment and dive into law, because this is where things get really, really fun. So we're going to touch on the state of US federal law. There's not much specific to say because there isn't really much at the federal level. There's rather more at the state level. And then we're going to do a really fun deep dive, definitely the deepest part of this discussion on copyright law. We'll briefly talk about privacy, quick mention on patent law. We'll touch a bit on software code and the implications of generating code from AI. We'll spend a bit more time on EU law because they are actually taking the most structured approach. And we'll touch on a few cool bits of breaking news around AI. Yeah, obviously this needs its own dedicated lecture, but look, we'll do the best we can here. So at a federal level, there isn't really anything actually on the books as far as actual laws are concerned. The whole alphabet soup of administrations and organizations have definitely issued so-called statements. Again, I don't want to just read you things verbatim, and in the interest of time, therefore, I'm definitely not going to. But suffice to say, there's a lot of concern from the various administrations at the US kind of federal level involving things like discrimination and bias, including and especially for so-called life, important life decisions, especially at a state level. We'll see in a moment. But there was just an announcement the other day from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. There's a risk that companies, banks especially, could be breaking the law if indeed their chatbots give incorrect advice. Because, of course that should be the case, right? If you're talking with a chatbot at your bank, and if it starts making mistakes and giving you false information, this is obviously a very bad thing, right? As a footnote to this, I will say, I don't believe any bank is actually using ChatGPT yet. I think that Chase is working with the OpenAI API to roll out a GPT-powered chatbot for Chase Bank, but I do not know if or when that's happening definitively. Let's see here. What else? There's a real need to get some sort of framework of risks and risk assessment. We want to track things, want to manage everything that's going on around that. Again, I don't want to just read this all to you verbatim, especially since none of it is actually officially official in the slightest. What is, I think, really interesting is what's happened more recently when Sam Altman, one of the co-founders of OpenAI, right? So he presented before the Senate Judiciary Committee back in May, as you might remember. He's a tech CEO begging for government regulation. Think about this. Like, when was the last time you ever heard of a tech CEO begging for regulation? And indeed, he's been doing a world tour, likewise, meeting with leaders around the world for the need for regulation. Specifically, he's calling out three things. There needs to be an agency to issue licenses for AI models. Kind of makes sense on its face, I suppose. We need to have safety standards and, of course, independent audits. This will all become more clear, I think, as we go through this talk. But suffice to say, he is one of the, I'm not mistaken, surely he is one of the 600 or so signatories to a request to pause all public testing, public, not private, all public testing of AI. There's a very, very big risk and a profound fear amongst all the top AI researchers in the world. Hopefully we'll have time at the end to talk a bit about this. State level, what have we got? Well, so California's, as I sort of alluded to a moment ago, they're suggesting that any sort of automated decision tool that can make so-called consequential decisions for things like life-changing stuff, housing, employment, health, voting, that sort of thing, we're probably going to need to make sure this stuff is regulated, right? There's several states, Maryland, Illinois, Texas, New York, they're very concerned with things like facial recognition, scanning facial geometry, even in the sense where there's no association by name, even if it's anonymized. New York is not disallowing AI for hiring tools, whether that's, scanning resumes, whether it's analyzing, say, video interviews for jobs, could be transcribing the interview, could be analyzing the tone of the video interview, right? It's not that they're disallowed, but they're going to require some really solid auditing to make sure there was no bias at play. So you might see a recurring theme throughout this going forward. I'm a huge proponent of, if not certainly publicly testing this stuff, certainly not banning it outright, because then I'm concerned that bad actors are going to start to use it in ways that we really, really don't want. let's dive even deeper now, because we're going to touch on copyright law. This is, I think, one of the most fascinating, mind-blowing bits of law today, honestly, which admittedly I never really cared about much in the past, but this is awesome. So again, LLM is what? It's a generative AI, right? GPT, we've touched on that at least twice now. I think you get it. But what does it mean practically, right? So what does the T in transformer really mean? So suppose that the output, well, suppose the LLM is trying to output some content. The cat sits on the blank. Well, what happens next? Well, it's going to run through its list of probable word associations. Does it sit on the cheeseburger? I mean, it's possible, and it's even kind of cute, if a bit weird, but it's probably not very likely, right? Does it sit on the piano, or indeed even in the piano? Well, having grown up with both cats and pianos, I suppose this is definitely possible and indeed somewhat probable. But it's really more likely the cat sits on the floor based on whatever was the context previously in the discussion, right? And so that's kind of how the probability engine goes. I mean, look, obviously I'm hyper simplifying this, right? I do think the best way to think about it is as this sort of probabilistic word cloud of stuff. So again, let's touch on what this means though, the parameters, right? Earlier, we clarified that parameters are not the amount of data, not the sort of number of scraped characters or words or whatever, right? It's the branching association of stuff, the contextual association of words derived from the training data, okay? Again, you're not pulling stuff out of Google's index. You're not, you're literally querying only that large language model based on the training data, which has long since been discarded, okay? Is that like super clear? There's no interaction whatsoever with the training data when you chat with a generative AI model, an LLM model like ChatGPT, Google Bing, whatever. So what does this mean practically? Well, I mean, you can see where this is going, right? This strongly suggests that the output is indeed truly novel from every sense of the word, right? It's based on patterns. It's not based on copying the training data or otherwise using. In fact, you cannot even get it to explicitly output stuff based on the training data, unless it's something really common, like in general spoken language, everyday language, right? Like, so for example, it'll tell you, what were the opening lines of Star Wars? C-3PO is saying, did you hear that? They shut down the main reactor, but it's not going to read to you. It's not going to output, say, the opening paragraph from the novelization of Star Wars. That's a totally different thing. So what does this actually mean? It means that practically look, nothing in the universe is truly zero, I suppose, except maybe reaching the speed of light. You just can't do that. But there's a vanishingly small, albeit non-zero, I suppose, probability of being able to reproduce original content verbatim. It's not going to happen. So let's just leave it at this for a moment. My argument, and I've heard a lot of great counter arguments, by the way, but my claim, my belief at this moment, and again, nobody knows how this is going to play out, is that really these things cannot be in violation of copyright. In general, as we'll see in a moment, there are certainly likely to be exceptions. So let's dive into this. How are we doing on time, by the way? Okay. Let's pick up the pace a little bit. Copyright law. So again, I don't know how much you're familiar with copyright law. I mean, I'm guessing there's a bit of a spectrum of knowledge here, but very briefly, obviously the idea is what? It's to protect the author of some work, and apparently a human author. This has been since clarified because of course it has, fixed in some sort of tangible medium of expression, granting copyright holder a set of exclusive rights. Well, one of those rights obviously is to so-called derivative works. So derivative work is obviously what it sounds like. You've got a thing that you've written or a musical score you've composed or a piece of artwork. Obviously, derivative means something based on that original work to which there's a copyright. I don't want to just read this to you verbatim again in the interest of time, but the idea is that a derivative work is something based on that original. And whenever we have some derivative work, there's going to be, sorry, let me rephrase. Whenever somebody creates a thing which is arguably a derivative work to an original, there's going to be a presumption of copyright infringement, right? Does that kind of make sense so far? So what does this mean though? Well, how do we excuse ourselves away from that? Well, there's the fair use test. Let's fly through these 4 factors because it's a little confusing, but let's just kind of make sense of it real quickly. So the first test is understanding the purpose and the character of the use. So first we want to see, is this derivative work transformative? Does it add some new sort of value to that original work, or is it indeed just a copy? Is it for profit or is it free? Well, look, if it's transformative, it's actually adding real new value to that original. And certainly if it's free, it's probably going to lean in favor of, in fact, not being derivative. What's the nature of the copyrighted work? Well, so there's kind of an inverse relationship here between fair use and creativity. So the more creative a thing is, the more artsy it is in nature, the less likely it is to be fair use. That might not be obviously intuitive at first, but if you think about it, the idea is that if something is factual, if you're just kind of stating a bunch of facts, well, you can't not be allowed to state factual stuff. But if you're recreating really creative works of art, say, then that's probably less likely to be fair use. Obviously, we're going to look at the amount and the substantiality of the portion of that original work used, right? So obviously, if you're reusing a lot more of it, probably not fair use. If you're using a lot less of it, maybe it is. This is going to have profound, mind-blowing implications a bit later in this talk. Just a teaser. I'm sure many of you have heard of Photoshop's generative fill technology. Yeah, so you can see where we're going with this, right? And then one quick inquiry is going to be on the effect on the market for that original work. Look, if you're producing a bunch of derivative stuff, which effectively ends up diluting the market value for that original, yeah, probably not okay. So I think this is actually fairly intuitive stuff, right? This is, I think, not super complex, but really important to keep in mind, as you'll see in a bit. So to be super clear, the question is less about whether there can be a copyright infringement generally, and rather, at least in my mind, the question is more like, can a generative AI model, can an LLM infringe on copyright? Again, how does this work? You've got training data, it goes into an LLM model that outputs stuff from its probability engine, right? Is it derivative? Well, here's a hint. Obviously, your stuff, let's say yours, a ton of people's copyrighted content was included in that training data back in whatever, September of 2021. So yeah, that copyrighted content indeed all went into the training. But again, remember, it's a trick question, right? Because the output's from the LLM, not the training data. So you can't really argue this. Quick aside, there's a big question, obviously, what happens with things like trade secrets, confidential sort of identifying information. Let's just say, not to state the obvious, but obviously, please redact everything that's personally identifying or otherwise confidential. I really hope this goes without saying. Just take it out. Just assume that it's probably not safe. Look, I realize there's probably a bunch of eye rolling going around. I've debated this ad nauseum with a bunch of really brilliant attorneys, and to their credit, they raise a lot of great points. In my defense, I'm going to try to validate what I'm saying here. Let's just do an experiment, right? If you read a bunch of books and you collect notes on the books, and then you write a term paper, I mean, what result? Is there, I don't know, plagiarism in academic sense? Is there copyright infringement? I mean, probably not, right? Unless you're just copy and pasting stuff, right? So what if an AI model, reads the internet? And we'll see in a moment the profound implications for the live internet connected versions of ChatGPT. It's kind of collecting notes, right? It's dumping this all into its LLM, and then it writes a paper. What result? I mean, as you'll see in a moment, believe it or not, probably no plagiarism or indeed even copyright infringement. Just hang on, I'll explain why in a moment. What about this? What if you prompt the AI to read a specific singular research paper, somebody's doctoral thesis on something, right? Okay, it's going to read the paper, it's going to collect its notes, dump it into its LLM, and then output something, for lack of a better term, effectively almost summarizing that paper, right? Probably that's going to be at least plagiarism, if not full-on copyright infringement. And let's unpack this to understand why. So here's the super important footnote about interconnected queries. So again, the standard version of ChatGPT is not internet connected. Internet connected versions include Google Bard, Bing, ChatGPT Plus. Here's the thing, training is once and done. It's not an ongoing rolling basis. It's not a thing that just continues in perpetuity. So when training data goes in, the LLM is generated, the training data is discarded. That's it, we're done. So what about live internet queries, right? So again, Microsoft Bing and ChatGPT Plus can actually query things beyond the data cap or the data cutoff of September 2021, right? What about those? Surely those must potentially be in violation, right? I mean, that's kind of the rational assumption, right? So it turns out that's not, again, in my opinion, this is almost certainly not, this cannot, or at least, as we'll see, should not be the case. This new content that it scrapes from live internet queries internally, guess what? It's just dumping it back into its LLM. It's effectively self-prompting itself with this live scraped content. And then it's outputting, you guessed it, novel content based on what was already in the LLM. So it's effectively just self-prompting it. It's not actually It's not regurgitating. It's not like copy pasting or otherwise remixing new content. It's literally producing novel content from that newly scraped information. It's a super nuanced distinction, but it's crucially important, even if you disagree with me on this, that we're at least on the same page in terms of understanding this. I was about to encourage somebody to ask a question if they want to, but let me actually, if you would please just continue. I suspect I might answer your questions actually. So again, I think there should not be a copyright violation. Now, obviously, this is not to say there can't be a copyright infringement ever, right? As we say in everything in law, there's always exceptions. Look, if you are, well, actually, we kind of touched on it earlier. If you're basically telling it to produce content based on a singular document or say somebody's video presentation on YouTube, which then transcribes and uses to make, I don't know, say a course on Udemy, and you kind of, I don't know, try to pass it off as your own knowledge, information, and then you try to sell it as your own course. Yeah, that's probably going to be a violation, but of course it is. There's going to be a reasonable test at some point. And kind of like a lot of copyright infringement cases generally, that shouldn't really be to the surprise of anybody. So to be clear, I'm not suggesting there can't ever be copyright. I'm just saying the general rule is that there shouldn't be. We've more or less touched on this. So let's just fly through for absolute clarity. Again, what's the difference, right? So non-internet connected queries, it's all 100% LLM generated output from the prior trained data. Internet queries, it's effectively self-prompting itself with the new content that it scrapes, but still outputting totally novel content. But yeah, if you're feeding it original content and asking it to produce output based solely on that content, yeah, that's probably going to be a violation. That's going to be an infringement on copyright, almost certainly, or at least it should be. I get it. This is super confusing, or perhaps non-intuitive, maybe. Or maybe it's not. Maybe this is super obvious to you, in which case, frankly, do let me know at the end. In general, I find this tends to be very confusingly received. So let me know what you think at the end, please. But here's what's super cool, and why I'm so firmly in belief of what I'm suggesting here. If you sort of follow this to its logical conclusion, right? Where is this all headed? So right now there's this question, which is, hey, is content generated by ChatGPT in the form of text, is this potentially a copyright infringement? I don't know. We've argued why it shouldn't be, right? What if instead of outputting text, ChatGPT were speaking to you? And indeed, there's certainly a lot of plugins that will let it do that. There's another cool product called yikes, I forget the name, but actually it does speak to you when you prompt it with questions. What about then? Are we going to say that that's a violation? Yeah, maybe. In fact, that is surely how the counter argument would go. Yeah, but if the end game is is indisputably an android, like our dear friend Data, are we going to seriously suggest as a policy matter that anything that comes out of his mouth is potentially in violation of copyright? Right? This doesn't make any sense. Again, even if legally there were an argument to be had, as a policy matter, we cannot do that because it literally shoots in the foot the very end game itself of synthetic artificial life. Because this is no longer a thing of science fiction. We're going to get there at some point, sooner rather than later. Maybe not in the form of a literal, actual, humanoid-looking android thing, but certainly in a cognitive sense, that's where we're headed. So if we already say that the AI-generated content is always at risk of violating, infringing on copyright, it's completely incompatible with where things are headed as a practical matter. As a policy matter, then, we really can't start to go down that path. Really quickly, there was a really fascinating case on this point. There was an Andy Warhol painting. Just to run through the facts, there was a celebrity photographer, took a photo of the singer Prince back in the 80s for a magazine, for profit. Vanity Fair, a different magazine, commissioned Andy Warhol to likewise create an image for Prince, also for profit. Basically, the courts decided that Warhol was indeed infringing on the copyright. It wasn't sufficiently, basically it didn't satisfy the fair use test. And then, oh wait, where's the picture? I thought I put the picture in here. Oh geez, sorry. Funny. In any event, there was a photo of Prince. There was the Prince from Andy Warhol, and they were indeed strikingly similar, different only in color. So that was the analysis the court looked at, right? Was it sufficiently transformative? Did it add something new? No, not really. They were both for profit. In contrast, the Campbell's Soup prints, which I recreated here with the help of Midjourney, they were seen more of a social commentary rather than commercial value. The Copyright Office has issued a set of formal guidance, basically stuff created with AI. Probably, we need a human to create things that are going to be copyrighted, right? So we can't just rely on AI generated things. There's got to be a substantial human involvement. I'm not going to read through this all for you. You can read through this on your own. So how does this work practically, right? So I've actually tried creating artwork with Midjourney. And the process is basically you go to Midjourney, you output the image, you hook up a Printify store, which then outputs the framed canvas print to sell on Etsy. So is there a copyright on this artwork that I create? Yeah, surely, probably not, because there was no human involvement. Yes, I'm prompting the generation, but the actual substantive creative outwork of the art product, if you will, is entirely done by AI. So yeah, probably no copyright. Okay, let's shift gears for a bit here. Privacy law. Let's just, in the interest of time, cut ahead for a bit. I think the most interesting thing here is Schumer has proposed 4 guardrails: the who, the where, the what, and the need to protect. We need to, and this is sort of similar, I think, some overlap anyway with what Sam Altman has suggested, right? So we need to understand who's trained the LLM and who's the intended audience, right? Because garbage in, garbage out. This is a big issue, obviously, with respect to things like bias and discrimination. We want to make sure the data source is disclosed for the same reasons, honestly. Explain the output, so sort of understand how this training data is being used. What is the output? What is the form? What is the intent? What is the audience, and so forth? And obviously, we want to protect everybody using this technology, right? So we've got a really transparent, really ethical bounds. And as you'll see in a moment, this is obviously very much the direction of what the EU is doing now. A brief mention on patents. Yeah, nothing to discuss here, really. If you want to patent a thing, you better be human. So poor data could not, in fact, patent something, apparently. Unless, of course, you're in South Africa. For reasons I have no idea why, it turns out that, okay, Australia, EU, and the UK, we're not going to grant patents to AI-generated inventions, but apparently in South Africa, it's still fair game. Software code. Brief discussion here, just something to keep in mind. If, excuse me, if you are generating code and the code is assisted with AI content. So for instance, let's see, GitHub Copilot, using any plugins for Visual Studio Code. If the code, excuse me, if the code is generated by AI, and if that output is itself bound to an open source license, well, guess what? The final product might also be bound to that open source license. So don't just assume that because you're making it that you are no longer that you are dissociated from that open source license. So super important to keep in mind. And as I say this, I'm just realizing how much of an overlap, if any, there is to be made as between my analysis previously with copyright law generally and code. I don't know. Let me get back to you on this. It's an interesting question. All right, let's dive into the EU. Just a funny thing, you may have heard this. On March 30th, Italy decided to ban ChatGPT. Apparently there was some GDPR violation. Apparently the opt-in, opt-out forms weren't really that clear. And then not 1 month later, they're like, okay, yeah, you can run GPT here in Italy. It was a real trivial thing, and it sounds somewhat funny, but the concern is a very real one where there's a question. I think Sam Altman's actually gone on the record about this. There's a very real question of the practical degree to which companies building AI models can indeed conform with regulations. They could just end up being, well, potentially unenforceable, but that's a whole other issue, but they could just be totally impracticable. I mean, so that's just something to keep in mind, right? So how this is going to play out is, well, it kind of leads to this actually. So this is what the EU have said. We're going to have a tiered structure, which, tiered things work pretty well usually. I do have a few questions about this, but suffice to say, it's based on a sort of a risk assessment, right? So at the very bottom, suppose AI is used for spam filters, for video games. Quick aside, I don't know if those of you have read about this. It turns out now that non-playable video game characters will soon be able to communicate with you in-game by way of a ChatGPT type of speech engine, which, if you think about it, that's pretty mind-blowing, right? Anyway, minimal risk stuff. Nobody cares about this. Second up the ladder, we've got chatbots, deep fakes, emotion recognition. This is kind of heightened risk. or limited risk, as they say. We want to have some more transparency. Quick aside, my own personal thought on this, I'm actually very surprised things like chatbots and deepfakes are so low on this list, because the concern of AI, again, time permitting, hopefully we'll touch on this at the end, is that you can effectively, as they say, it can fundamentally hack the operating system of modern civilization by virtue of hacking language. We are now living in the era where it is impossible. There is no experiment that can any longer be conducted to determine whether a person speaking to you or a voice on the phone is indeed the human you think it is, or whether it's an AI-generated construct. It's just impossible. There is no experiment. It's sort of like what Einstein said, there's no experiment you can do to decide whether you're like in an elevator accelerating upward or whether you're standing on the earth. The force on your body is exactly the same. There is no experiment. So I'm a little surprised this is so low on the list. Anyway, further up, obviously things that go to education, employment, and justice, blah, blah, blah. This is obviously requiring a higher risk. And finally, at the very top, we're just going to categorically disallow things like social scoring, facial recognition, and so on. So look, I like this structure. I think it makes a lot of sense. As I say, I'm a little concerned about the whole deep fake thing, especially when used in conjunction with chatbots, though. There are going to be some pretty hefty fines, 6% of global revenue for non-compliance. For foundation models like ChatGPT-4, they really do require stricter scrutiny as far as testing, mitigating risks. There's a very real concern for the fundamental threat this poses to democracy itself by virtue of potentially what shall we say, invalidating language itself. Again, we're going to circle back to discuss this practically in a moment. Some breaking news real quick to kind of connect all these dots. Look, it turns out that what I was suggesting isn't so far-fetched after all. Not that it really has any bearing whatsoever on laws here in the US, and I realize this is worded a bit ambiguously, but effectively Japan has just announced, look, we're not going to, there cannot be copyright infringement on LLM generated output because it is indeed novel and the training data is indeed not used directly. So there you have it. This is kind of funny. I just want to mention this real quickly. This is a super bizarre fact pattern, but apparently there was a journalist researching a lawsuit between, say, X and Y. It doesn't even matter. And while researching this lawsuit, this journalist, he was querying ChatGPT for some info. And for some reason, somehow, this poor guy, what's his name? Mark Walters, his name pops up somehow associated with, I guess, one of the parties in the suit that the journalist was investigating, right? And so this poor guy is suddenly put on the line for supposedly, he's basically saying, look, I've been defamed by OpenAI. It's saying that I've, embezzled money and this, that, the other, and fraud. So he's actually suing OpenAI now. I mean, I'd love to kind of deep dive this and brainstorm this with all of you, but I really question whether he even has standing, honestly, or whether indeed he was actually harmed, unless it is somehow defamation per se, I suppose. But anyway, just kind of I'm pretty sure this is the first such case of its kind. Speaking of breaking news, just a fun little plug here. Again, if you're interested in keeping up on AI news, I do this daily newsletter every morning. So look, how do you integrate this technology safely? First, let me just say, any law practice, or indeed any business really, not fully embracing AI, will be dead or dying by 2025. You could totally hold me to this. If I'm wrong, oh well, you'll be ahead of the game. And if I'm right, well, you'll be happy you listened. So what not to do? Well, I'm sure by now you've all heard of this ridiculous thing that happened in New York with all due respect to the attorney, the guy's been practicing law for like 30 years. But as you may have heard, there was a lawsuit against an airline in South America, Avianca Airlines. And basically he used ChatGPT to do a lot of his legal research. A bunch of bogus cases were presented to him. He relied on them, although he did stop and ask ChatGPT, hey, are you sure about this? Are you sure these are accurate? ChatGPT says, yes, of course, I'm sure. And off he goes. Well, it turns out that all the cases were at best, real cases, but with incorrect facts and dates. And at worst, they were totally fabricated cases. So, his defense was that he was totally unaware of the possibility that the content output from ChatGPT could, in fact, be false. This is a really silly thing. Everyone's blowing this up to say, oh, you see how bad things like generative AI are. I think it's pretty silly. I mean, look, at the end of the day, ChatGPT is just a tool. So remember, you got to remember Spidey, with great power comes great responsibility. Don't be a fool. You're the lawyer, not the tool. And again, you can replace lawyer with any profession. It's really great, obviously, except when it isn't. The danger, the risk factor, by the way, is that it's so good at seeming accurate, right? That's what's dangerous. So it is admittedly a potentially dangerous tool because it's so good. To use a somewhat off the ball analogy. It's kind of like if any of you have a Tesla, okay, granted, Tesla's full self-driving beta is definitively not true autonomous driving by any means, but it is actually now at that point where it's good enough where it can make you a bit lazy and ironically more likely to fall asleep at the wheel and crash, although you probably wouldn't crash because of its safety mechanisms, but that's not the point. All right, so let's see here. Real quick, I have a dear friend working up at the in Sacramento. She's the district attorney general. Their office has been categorically disallowed from ever using ChatGPT. There's a judge in Texas who said, look, you can use this stuff, but just first certify that no portion of the filing was drafted by AI and or I guess alternatively that you were the final set of eyeballs on the content. And this to me makes sense. I think banning this thing outright is the worst possible thing, whether for work or for school. Yeah, so look, a ton of great use cases. I'm not going to rattle through these now. One thing I forgot to mention earlier, just as an aside for the profound civilization-changing value of this technology is that, so in the field of medicine, and this actually predates generative AI, it turns out that AI is already much better at analyzing things like mammograms than a human doctor. I mean, it is markedly better. So I mean, it's not hyperbole to say the degree to which it's changing civilization. We've talked a bit about ethics and some concerns generally. So obviously there's a very real concern for bias and discrimination, the so-called hallucinations, misinformation, facts. By the way, funny, interesting thing I just thought about here. We know that this must be novel content, right? Because if it were in fact just copying what it had from the training data, how could it just fabricate all this ridiculous nonsense? So clearly it is novel content. There's a very real concern, obviously, for deception, as we touched on earlier, deep fakes and propaganda, privacy issues with respect to IP generally. Yeah, privacy and security issues, we mentioned that also as well. Just make sure you redact everything. There was a question I heard a while back. Is there a potential argument for the unauthorized practice of law? It was couched in context of copyright infringement. I think that's not even relevant, but it is a good question. If AI is doing something which is effectively the practice of law, is there potential grounds for a UPL claim? And I would say, I suppose there could be, but I think the more important point is simply whether it's an AI system or whether it's, I don't know, summer associate in a law school, the lawyer does need to be the final set of eyes. So again, I think this is somewhat common sense. I managed to score this domain, so of course I bought it. This goes to the services I provide to lawyers and law firms generally. Funny thing, talk about meta. So it turns out you can prompt ChatGPT to write its own rules. In this case, obviously for the California rule of ethics. I won't bore you with reading it. I think you can probably, I can shoot over a screenshot later if you want to see it. But suffice to say, I actually sent this to my aforementioned friend, the DAG in Sacramento, and she was like, "Mark, you've got to send this to Sacramento, to the state bar. This is amazing." I was like, "Hey, ChatGPT made this, not me." And her mind was like blown. It's really great. I mean, this is super meta. We've got AI writing its own ethics rules, right? Real quick on this, for those of you who have used or intend to use Lexis for legal research, earlier we've been talking a lot about the training data, what goes in, comes out, right? So Lexis is obviously remedying the issue of that poor lawyer in New York. They're finally going to merge their knowledge base with ChatGPT. So the training data will be the legal database of Lexis. And so it'll be routed into sort of a separate set of training data merged in, I guess, presumably with whatever ChatGPT has from September of 21. And so now the legal research will indeed be, at least presumably, accurate. So this is very cool. This is where things are headed. This is going to completely transform. I mean, the practice of law is suddenly going to get really awesome and a lot less tedious. So what's next? Do we have a few minutes? Yes, we have 6 minutes, I think. I don't know how many of you have seen this quote. Your little windows are actually overlapping a lot of the, oh, there we go, I shrunk the windows. Okay. 50% of AI researchers believe there's a 10% or greater chance that humans go extinct from our inability to control AI. Just to put a practical sort of analogy on this, I don't know, would any of you get on an airplane which had a 10% or greater chance of crashing? I mean, obviously you probably wouldn't. By the way, if there's one thing that you watch to kind of self-educate further, make it this documentary on YouTube. It's made by the same guys that did the phenomenal documentary, The Social Dilemma. So, okay, there's obviously a question as to how and why. How can this possibly be, right? So first of all, everything is happening much, much faster than anticipated. 3 to 4 years. Nobody thought anything would occur this quickly. Also, furthermore, and really just completely mind-blowingly so, everything's kind of deployed in the inverse. What we assumed, I say we, what the AI researchers assumed was that, first we would end up with like these big lumbering robots, and then very kind of superficial, high level human cognition, and then real deep, low level cognition, many, many decades, perhaps even a century hence, right? But it's actually been the exact opposite. If you look at what ChatGPT is doing, and well, the lack of any human type robots. So there's kind of a whole spectrum of consequences from this, right? Ranging from the dangerous to the great. So the dangerous thing is that, yeah, we are indeed in a sort of phase now where we're testing this stuff publicly. It's like the airplane I mentioned with passengers. It's like doing above ground nuclear testing. And just to give you a crazy example, so ChatGPT a while back was able to explain to you how to create nerve gas from common ingredients purchased at Home Depot. Why? Did like OpenAI train it on how to do this? No. And in fact, by the way, as an aside, I forgot to mention earlier, OpenAI didn't explicitly train ChatGPT with certain languages, like, say, Farsi, for instance. So how did ChatGPT learn how to create nerve gas or speak Farsi? It literally trained itself spontaneously. Is it not hyperbole? I'm not just like sort of making stuff up here. What you need to realize is that the AI of today is now creating things and doing things that there are zero researchers on the planet that can explain how and why it's happening. Very briefly, this is kind of neat, right? On the one hand, this is kind of potentially raising the baseline of human capability. It's potentially risky because, like our lawyer in New York, it also makes it a lot easier to make catastrophic mistakes. On the flip side, as the NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang says, AI is indeed going to be an assistant that will enable anyone to be a programmer. So I think this is a really beautiful thing, actually. It basically means that you can now do what you love instead of necessarily only what you're best at. Very briefly, I can share this with you later if you'd like, but look, I made a comment a while back when I launched my law practice for AI startups. And I said, I thought it was a pretty nice niche to kind of focus and zero in on. Whoever I was telling this to looked at me and said, niche, what do you mean? This is literally every startup in San Francisco now. So point taken, because yeah, everybody is doing AI-based startups these days. So where are we headed? We are literally experiencing mathematical double exponential growth. So as we saw earlier, the training data capabilities have ramped up exponentially, but so too is the self-learning of these AI models. So it's literally an exponential growth on top of exponential growth. As we saw a moment ago, they are indeed self-learning. They're very good at faking sentience. They're not yet there, but superhuman cognition is, in any event, much closer than we anticipated. What's the concern? Everybody says inevitably, look, we're not going to seriously have a Terminator 2 type of future in the next couple of decades, are we? Look, no, we're not. But then if you stop to think about it for a second, you don't need sentience and big lumbering robots to cause widespread civilization unraveling, right? So as was mentioned in that documentary I told you about a moment ago, the first generation of social media as a whole was kind of the first generation AI 1.0. We're literally living in a time where people are still debating who won the elections, whether vaccines work, whether the earth is flat, whether we landed on the moon. And this is proof positive that social media, AI 1.0, because of its capability of disseminating content en masse, it's already had a non-zero adverse impact on society, right? AI 2.0 isn't just disseminating information, it's creating it, new stuff, and disseminating that. This is literally, those are the only two ingredients you need to unravel language and indeed, therefore, society. So the concern is not like AI hates humans and wants to kill us, but that as a consequence of hyper-optimizing, say, for one variable, we will just be harmed in the process. To use a somewhat tongue-in-cheek example, suppose AI says, hey, that oxygen stuff, it's pretty corrosive to my metallic components. I should probably reduce it a bit, and then humans die. In the flip side, isn't this what we always do? We didn't, hunt elephants to near extinction because we hated elephants, right? Some people just wanted to make money off their ivory. We don't hate Canadian geese. We just accidentally fly airplanes through them. Not very nice, but it's certainly not intentional. And indeed, we try to avoid doing that because it hurts us too. So that's kind of the risk. So you could sort of think of hyper-optimizing for one variable, kind of like the inverse, the opposite of Pareto optimality, right? So Pareto optimal in economics says what? It says that in a closed system of variables, you cannot further optimize any one variable without having a detrimental effect a de-optimizing effect on any one or more variables, right? So hyper-optimizing for one variable, that's the risk here. So look, I do want to end on a happy note though, honestly, because I think this is, well, I'll just read to you what I've kind of thought of over the last several months. I firmly believe that we need to therefore indeed temper AI before we lose it forever. For the record, I will be completely unsurprised if even here in the US, we have the likes of ChatGPT and other such technologies restricted, maybe partially, indeed, perhaps even fully. I'm not saying I think it's likely. I'm just saying I'm not surprised. And we've already seen in Italy, they did this, right? Albeit for a brief period of time. So I really think it's important that we just regulate it before we risk losing it, or indeed before greater harm should occur. Let me just ramble this off to you because it's something that occurred to me. I think it's this is like the most powerful tool that humanity's ever seen, but also the most beautiful. It's a catalyst for innovation and creativity. It's equally as potent for science as for art. It actually, true story, empowers blind people with a private testing version of ChatGPT. They can feed it a photograph of the contents of their fridge, and it'll tell them from image recognition, which is so precise, like a human, it can tell them what they can cook using the contents of their fridge. It gives a 50-year-old truck driver both the confidence and the capacity, the capability really, to shift gears metaphorically and from trucking into coding, which until now was obviously a totally insurmountable and borderline insulting thing to even consider as a career pivot. It helps freshly minted lawyers open their first law practice, a stay-at-home parent to launch an Etsy store full of artwork. So if computers are our tools, the internet's the medium we work in, then I really believe that AI is kind of this USB stick of perpetual drip feed of knowledge in our brains for us to tap at will. So I think it's really going to open this incredible new future of just sort of pausing to think, what do you feel like doing today? And that is kind of goosebump inducing for me every time I say it, because I think this is so cool. And on that note, that is a wrap. Thank you so much for listening. Happy to take questions.